So, greetings. Happy to be here and be sitting here. I bike down from my home every morning, so it's a wonderful, little bit exhilarating bike down the hill, and sitting down here to be with all of you is a very comfortable and now becoming a familiar place to be in the morning. Thank you. There are times that there's a correspondence between the macrocosm and the microcosm. And some people make a lot to do about this, but one area where I find it useful is to see that the wider ways in which we live our lives can be correspond to or be represented by or epitomized by our relationship to breathing in meditation. Not always the case, and there are people for whom there's much better objects for them to meditate with than the breathing. But it's a very classic practice, mindfulness of breathing and having breathing at the center. And I've been doing that now for pretty much my whole adult life. And I just love sitting down to be with my breathing. And so this way that the microcosm is represented kind of represents the macrocosm of our life is one interesting area is if the breathing is kind of the center of gravity for meditation. If nothing else is compelling, we come and stay with the breathing and develop both mindfulness and concentration there. That sooner or later, and the chances are it's going to be very soon, especially when you first sit down, the mind will wander away and you'll kind of lose contact with the breathing, and notice that your mind has drifted off, and then begin again with the breathing. So that's a pretty common phenomena, very common to be expected. Part of meditation is to working with that that little process, this very little microcosm of the mind wandering away and then beginning again. So what I want to emphasize in this meditation is the care and attention to how you begin again with your breathing. That is a little microcosm, can be, of how we relate to so many things in our life. So it'll be very easy to have the mind wander off, and since the task is to stay with the breathing, when the mind wanders off, is to berate oneself, or to be upset, or feel like I'm failed, or not doing what I should have done. And then to pounce back on the breath, or jerk the mind back, or maybe with an ever so slight kind of maybe irritation, come back to the breathing, or disappointment that here again the mind wandered off. There's all these kind of little things, and they could be so teeny that maybe in ordinary life or ordinary meditation we almost don't see it unless we pay attention to it. Especially if you've been meditating for a long time. It's become so habitual how we begin again or start over, how we relate to the thinking mind, that we might not see there's a subtle traces of something that is a little bit of dukkha, a little bit of suffering, tension, little discomfort in what we do. And what I want to suggest for this meditation is that one of the things we're developing in our life in general, and also in our ethical life, is resilience. And the ability to see clearly what's happened, but not to be burdened with unnecessary beratement, self-criticism, unnecessary kind of discouragement or aversion, or all kind of creating or reinforcing a certain idea of self in what we do that might subtly or maybe grossly, coarsely cause harm in the world, or be unfortunate in what we said, or not quite right. We feel not quite right what I said or what I did. And to have resilience with that means to, just like with the mind wandering off with the breathing, is to see it honestly and clearly, to learn from it, to grow from it, but not to do anything harmful to yourself in that process. And to have the resiliency to start again, to see clearly what's there, and then begin again in a kind of fresh way, but with ethical life, not forgetting about it, but always coming back and stepping forward into the next moment. And so we can begin to learn this, what I call resiliency, if we're careful about how we begin again, that to begin again in a way that is fresh, that is clear, that's not weighed down by any slightest little hint of criticism or disappointment or idea of failure or impatience or whatever it might be, but to have it be as simple as your hand comes to kind of touch your other hand. In a gentle, calm, relaxed way, the hands come back in touch with each other. So the awareness comes back in touch with the breathing. We recognize we wandered off, and then we experiment. It's learning a new habit, a new way of being with that whole teeny little microcosm. And the suggestion I have for you is that microcosm will cultivate wonderful capacities in other areas of your life, that it'll grow and that habit will spread and make a huge difference. So if you would like to take your meditation posture, and gently close your eyes, and then to begin with an attitude or approach that feels nourishing for you, feels supportive for you, moves you in the direction I'm talking about here, of freshness and openness, without a lot of self or self-concern or impatience or idea of I should or obligation, whatever extra there might be. Just right away, experiment, adjust, look for that attitude of how to be here in meditation. And then to bring this kind of attention to your breathing. Some people like the idea of welcoming the breath. Or if welcoming is too complicated, allowing the breath to come to awareness, as opposed to directing the mind to breathing. Opening the door of awareness so that breathing can arrive. Just be here in a very simple way. And your mind will be as it is. Maybe there's agitation, maybe it's calm. And perhaps having an attitude to how the mind is that is not so troubled by it, not adversarial towards anything. And whenever the mind wanders off in thought, to acknowledge that, and then the real part of this meditation begins. To begin again with the breathing in a way that is peaceful, supportive, that is itself maybe an expression of freedom or ease or peace or care. So every time the mind wanders off, The heart of this meditation is how you begin again with your breathing. Sometimes in meditation, we want to try experimenting. And one experiment is every time the mind wanders off, and you notice it, experiment with different ways of beginning again. Until you find a way to begin again that you enjoy. That is supportive. That in some way creates the inner landscape that then encourages you to stay present with the breathing. It feels good here. What old habits do you have to let go of or shift so that starting again is a kind of resiliency to overcome any ways in which you have weighed yourself down. And then as we come to the end of this meditation, this microcosm of how we begin again with the breathing, or whatever our meditation object is, how can that be applied or understood in relationship to how we are present for other people? When someone shows up and is here in front of us, or they call us, or they send us an email, how is it that we can adjust our attention to include them, that we can learn from how we begin again and to include the breathing? How is it that in our encounters with others, we can shed some of the unnecessary weight that we have around self-consciousness or subtle aversion or even aggression or reluctance, impatience, fear, anxiety, to begin again with this person, so that how we show up and how we are with someone is enjoyable to ourselves, is nourishing for ourselves. And as we learn this art of being present for others in a way that is something we appreciate, something we value and look forward to, the way we are, chances are that that way of being is conducive to living an ethical life with them, is conducive to having care, is conducive to having the aspiration or the goodwill expressed in the idea of, may they be happy, may they be peaceful, may they have an inner life which feels safe and happy, peaceful, nourishing. And may it be today, as you go about your life, that for the encounters you have with others, whether in person, phone, email, or even just reading about someone else, a stranger on the street, see if you can experiment the same way you experimented with your breathing, and show up for those people in a way that's beautiful, at least for yourself. May our contact and relationship to other people help create a better world for everyone. So today I'll continue this conversation about ethics, Buddhist ethics. I like to think of it as the ethics that comes out of doing our practice, as opposed to the ethics that comes out of Buddhist texts. Though I'll certainly refer to them today, Buddhist texts. And the first one I'll refer to, which I find quite inspiring, or more important than inspiring, instructive, is the Buddha talks about defines a wise person in a particular way. And it's interesting to see the difference between wisdom and how that's talked about and the description of a wise person. Because really it's the person we're trying to transform in Buddhism, to be a different kind of person, not just to know abstract wisdom or something that's out there in a sense, or just to have knowledge, to really become changed. And so to be a wise person of great wisdom, the Buddha said, such a person is concerned with the welfare of themselves, the welfare of others, the welfare of self and others, and the welfare of the whole world. And in terms of ethics, to be concerned for the welfare of the whole world and welfare of others, and it includes oneself, is an ethical possibility, potential that we have. And this is, to be a wise person, that's the whole direction in which we're moving in Buddhism, is to become a wise person. And it's not, again, not book learning, but rather it's defined by becoming a person who's concerned for the welfare of all beings. That's the goal, and that points to how I'm emphasizing this week that the path of liberation and the path of what we call in the West, call ethics, are the same thing. That the ethical, spiritual maturation in Buddhism is the same as ethical maturation. And it's just that they don't have that language of, in the ancient world, of ethics like we have that word in English. So we don't find that word there in some clear way saying that. But definitely that's the way the texts are going. Interesting, the Buddha also said that someone who's spiritually mature not only lives by the precepts, lives in that kind of ethical way, but also encourages others to live that way. And exactly what this means to encourage others to live this way is, that's a fascinating topic, and in different settings it might look differently. In some settings, it might be to somehow stand up for social justice, and where people are killing each other or harming each other, we would stand up and encourage them not to do that. And that encouragement, maybe as acts of civil disobedience, could be quite strong and powerful, but that would be an expression of encouraging others not to kill. And it wouldn't be done with hostility, but it would be done with real strength. A wise person lives by the precepts and encourages others to do it as well. And so becoming a wise person has this ethical component in part. And where does that ethics comes from? And it comes from a kind of ethical sensitivity. And that mindfulness itself has an ethical component to it, in that it cultivates the sensitivity to recognize within oneself what is harmful and what is beneficial. And this ability to really refine one's capacity to understand in ourselves what is afflictive, what causes affliction, and what causes welfare, that is the primary criteria for understanding what is ethical in the Buddhist tradition. There is a story of the Buddha teaching his son. Not everyone knows the Buddha had a son, and the Buddha went off and about 6 years to go off and practice and become enlightened. Went off to graduate school in a sense, and then came back to his hometown, to his family, at which point his son ordained as a 7-year-old, became a novice monk, and then for the rest of the son's growing up, he was under the tutelage of his father. In a sense, the Buddha was the primary parent for much of his son's life. And but there's a story of the Buddha saying in very strong terms to his son how important it is not to lie. The text in the middle-length discourses doesn't say what happened, but most people who read it say, well, this is pretty obvious that his child had said a lie, and it was caught saying the lie, and so the Buddha then, without saying something directly criticizing him specifically, said something a little bit more removed about lying. He said something like, the value of someone who lives a monastic life, a monastic who lies, the value of that monastic life is as much as turning a bowl over upside down so all the water runs out. The amount of water that's left in the bowl is the worth of the monastic life of someone who lies. That's kind of strong language. And the Buddha goes on to say that if someone who consciously lies, that person would probably be willing to break all kinds of other precepts as well. It's that important. But what is even more valuable is what the Buddha said next. He said to his son, when you're going to do something, before you do it, while you do it, and after you do it, you should reflect and consider whether what I'm doing or what I did, what I'm going to do, is going to cause harm or affliction to others or not. You really want to, and he used the metaphor of a mirror. He said to his son, "Do you know what is a mirror for?" And his son said, "Mirror is for reflection." In the same way, you should you should look at yourself. You yourself are kind of the mirror for yourself. Look at yourself, or the question, is this afflictive or not afflictive? Is maybe the mirror to see in oneself. And so it does take this ethical consideration, this mindfulness of looking at what is afflictive and what is not afflictive, and learn to recognize that. And does it lead to pain and suffering, or does it lead to happiness for people, for yourself and for others? And when he said, does it lead to affliction, he said, does it lead to affliction to oneself, or does it lead to the affliction to others, or does it lead to the affliction of both self and others? So here he's talking to a young child, and he has the same kind of teaching as he does about a wise person, that the concern is in all directions, to self and others, and self and others. And the criteria is it afflictive? And how do we know it's afflictive? Through our powers of attention, through paying attention to ourselves. And we ourselves as a standard, we ourselves have the empathy, the reference point for really understanding how others are hurt by us. And so the more we can develop ethical sensitivity and feel how we experience stress, how we experience affliction and pain and harm by our actions or maybe the actions of others, that we wake up the capacity to be sensitive to these kinds of issues. And so then we're more careful. So to make this kind of at the heart of Buddhist ethics means that we are the arbitrator for what is ethical through the criteria of what is causing harm and what is afflictive or not. It's not abstract moral code, rules out there that one has to adopt. There's no one in Buddhism outside who, has some kind of abstract moral code that really is the heart of it all. The heart of it is this capacity to recognize harm and benefit. And to do that is really strengthened by our capacity to be mindful, to be attentive, to be here. We will make mistakes. We will do things that are harmful. We will it can be very, very subtle, the ways at which we, cause little pieces of stress. But this attention to what's afflictive and non-afflictive, to suffering and happiness. This is, even though it's a teaching to a young child here, I've heard Buddhist teachers emphasize how this little teaching is actually at the very heart of the Buddhist path, and all the way to enlightenment, that this little distinction to see what's afflictive and non-afflictive, what causes suffering and what causes happiness, that's the guide and support for the path to liberation. And because it has to do with affliction and pain and suffering and happiness, it's also in Buddhism the path on the path of ethics, to becoming ethically mature. The two are one and the same. They're not any distinct from each other. So it might seem a little simplistic to begin ethics by looking at what's afflictive and what's not, what's suffering and what's happiness. But that's really the reliable criteria that if we learn to be skilled at recognizing that, we'll find our ways both personally and socially in very, very effective ways. And it's a phenomenal support. And one of the things it means is that the way that we're ethical also needs to be non-afflictive. The way that we hold ourselves in an ethical way, it's not going to cause harm. It's actually going to be something which brings happiness and well-being. And how do we experiment, like we did with the breathing today? How do we experiment with the way we behave in the world and how we speak, so that we can be resilient and learn from what we do and not be weighed down by things, but be able to kind of come back to a ethical way of being or a fresh way of being. So that is nourishing and supportive. And that supportive and nourishing in a way that then encourages further ethics, or if you do, further ethical approach to life. And if you don't like kind of the idea of the ethical approach to life, it's completely fine for it to be a liberative aspect of life. How do you more conducive to liberation and freedom and wisdom? How can you come back so that is the direction you go? And why I can so confidently say it's fine, either one, is because they're one and the same. There's no difference. So one of the primary principles of this early Buddhist ethics has to do with our capacity to be sensitive to what causes affliction and what causes welfare, what causes suffering and what brings about happiness. So I'll talk more about this tomorrow, and thank you for being here.